Have you ever met someone who just radically believed God even when it didn't make sense? It's this level of faith we all desire, but sometimes lack. What we have to understand about faith or belief is that oftentimes it's not a matter of you just have it or you don't. Many times faith and belief can start small, like the size of a mustard seed, as Jesus tells us, and then grows into maturity. In our reading today, we see Zechariah grow in his faith and experience the blessing of belief. Luke chapter 1 verses 57 through 64 tells us, "Now the time came for Elizabeth to give birth, and she bore a son. And her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown great mercy to her, and they rejoiced with her. And on the 8th day they came to circumcise the child. And they would have called him Zechariah after his father, but his mother answered, 'No, he shall be called John.' And they said to her, 'None of your relatives are called by this name.' And they made signs to his father, inquiring what he wanted him to be called. And he asked for a writing tablet and wrote, 'His name is John.' And they all wondered. And immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue loosed, and he spoke, blessing the Lord." In today's text, we read that Elizabeth gives birth to her promised child that Gabriel foretold would come, and he is given the name John. It is then that Zechariah's voice returns to him so that he can speak again. He then uses his voice to praise and bless the Lord for the salvation he knows and believes will come through the Messiah, of whom his son will pave the way. Now, I want to briefly go back to when Zechariah initially lost his voice. If you remember, we learned that he lost his voice because he did not believe when Gabriel told him that he and Elizabeth would have a child. I wondered, however, why did Zechariah lose his voice for questioning how his wife would become pregnant and birth a child in their old age? But Mary didn't lose her voice or acquire any kind of consequences when she questioned how she would give birth as a virgin. The answer lies in Gabriel's response to Zechariah's question. He said, "Because you did not believe the words I have spoken to you, you will not be able to speak until the child is born." So Zechariah didn't lose his voice because he asked the question. He lost his voice because he didn't believe. His questions were not out of curiosity like Mary, but his questions were out of disbelief. It wasn't the questions themselves that were the issue. It was the condition of Zechariah's heart. It's okay to question God, but why you question him matters. As we've learned, answers are not required to believe, and understanding how everything will work out is not required for our faith. When we question God without belief, we're asking God to prove himself. We're testing him. When Satan tempted Jesus in the wilderness, Jesus responded by saying, God should not be put to the test. Now, what this meant was we can question God, but we do not have the authority to require God to prove himself to us. Because when we question God without belief in who he is, his answer doesn't matter. We will come up with excuse after excuse as to why that's not true, or why we couldn't believe it, or this can't be. If we look at Gabriel's response to Zechariah's question, we will see Gabriel doesn't answer him at all. He doesn't even try to. Gabriel doesn't give him an answer because he knows there's no belief in his question. Therefore, Zechariah wouldn't believe anything he had to say. We see Jesus do this countless times in the New Testament. Sometimes people would question Jesus and he would gently answer them and help them with their doubt. But sometimes when people question Jesus, primarily the religious leaders of the day, Jesus didn't respond to them at all. He didn't even answer their questions because they weren't concerned with the answers. They just wanted to trick Jesus. They just wanted to test Jesus. They wanted to prove a point that he wasn't really who he said he was. They didn't believe. There's no point in answering someone who is intent on not believing you. But the hope that we see in the testimony of Zechariah is that his heart starts to change. It took Zechariah seeing the birth of his son John to finally believe. And then he was able to speak again because he believed. Some people believe even before there is physical evidence of what they are believing in, much like Mary. God's character is enough for them to believe even when they can't see. This is why Mary was considered blessed. Now others, like Zechariah, don't believe until they see. In John chapter 20, verse 29, Jesus says, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." So we learn that there is a difference in how people come to belief. Some people believe because God says so, or some people believe because they finally see the hand of God working in their lives. This was Zechariah's case. However, now that Zechariah saw the birth of his son and believed, he also now believed in the coming Messiah. So we see a transition in the heart of Zechariah here, and he gives a beautiful prophecy in Luke chapter 1, verses 67 through 79, that is called the Benedictus, where Zechariah praises God for the coming Messiah. Because he has seen the birth of his son John, Zechariah's faith and belief has grown to now be able to believe things that he hasn't seen yet. He now believes that God will send Jesus to save the world. Now, Jesus wasn't born yet, but Zechariah now has developed a faith that believes even without seeing. And sometimes that's what it takes for some people, because Zechariah had a choice. He could have come up with excuses as to why he and Elizabeth had John. He could have just said, "Oh, it was a coincidence," or "we just got lucky," and continued not to believe. But instead, Zechariah's heart was changed. His belief and his faith in God grew. It's often challenging to believe God, especially when we can't see what he's doing. When God gives us an opportunity to see his hand moving in our lives and the lives of those around us, we then have a choice if we will believe or not. We have a choice if we'll move from believing when we see to believing even when we don't see. Last lesson, we learned that Mary was blessed because of her belief. Blessed is she who believes, the scripture tells us. And now, Zechariah held this same belief and blessing. It took him a while to get there, but he got there nonetheless. We are all on a faith journey with an aim to know God more and thus believe him more. This Christmas season offers a wonderful opportunity to dwell on the character and goodness of our God, to grow our belief so that, like Mary and now Zechariah, we too may be blessed.